Alright, I'm a bit late, but let's start the video. Now, for many Americans, in terms of important time periods, the Great Depression and the response to it are among the most important time periods and situations that the United States has had to deal with. But I'm gonna critique our response to it, not just Hoover's, but FDR's as well. And basically, I'm gonna divide it into 2 sections. What should have been done, and what was done. Naturally, if we're going to talk about what should have been done, let's talk about what happened and how it was responded to. So, following a series of policies by the federal government and personal choice, the financial market crashed in the late 1920s. This is known as, I believe, Black Monday, but I could be misremembering. Naturally, there's a lot of dark days in U.S. history, so there's Black Friday, there's Black Monday. Needless to say, it was just a bad time all around. Maybe it was Black Tuesday. Regardless, the exact day doesn't matter. What is important is that when it happened, the current government was led by one Herbert Hoover, the former person in charge of managing food during World War I, and the person who engaged in humanitarian relief during the Russian Civil War. So what were Hoover's policies? Well, a lot of people like to say he was laissez-faire. That would be inaccurate. He tried to prop up wages, deported Mexicans, and I mean as in he literally deported people who were of Mexican descent. He basically said, all those people, send them over the border. Not because they're illegal or anything, just because I don't like them and I want to give American workers jobs. He engaged in massive standardization of patents, and he started public works. That's why we have Hoover Dam, with his most famous, of course, being tariffs. I believe Smoot-Hawley was the name, though I mix up tariff names all the time, so needless to say, not good. And what did this cause? Well, a few things. 1. By propping up wages, there was a major problem because businesses were losing money. The entire problem with the Depression was industry could not afford to keep running. And so, what ended up happening? Well, if they couldn't lower wages, they had to make up for their losses in other ways. So they just fired people. And if you fire people, those people aren't getting paid, so they can't buy things. And you can see how this escalates. Whereas you would instead see, let's say, 10-20% decrease in wages, you instead saw that decrease in the amount of people working. Thus, unemployment became rampant, and while demand still existed, the people who actually wanted things couldn't afford them because they were unemployed now. Without people buying goods, businesses went even further down, and so it spiraled. Bank runs became common, and because the rules and regulations regarding banking meant that you couldn't establish multiple branches like was done in Canada, a lot of banks went under. Essentially, smaller banks didn't have the reserves of larger banks, and so after one bank run, they went out, and people were left holding the bag of nothing that they could get from the banks, if they could even get a bag at all. The deportations didn't really help things because, well, yes, it allowed the average American to compete more in terms of labor. It didn't solve the real problem. The problem was not the labor force, but rather the fact that the government was limiting how much people could lower wages or export goods. And through those limitations, it didn't matter how many people you deported. You could deport half the freaking country and there'd still be a problem. The standardization made it so that things were less flexible, though it did have some benefits because, as one might imagine, it makes radios and airports a whole lot easier to communicate, though there's still the worry of cartels. Essentially, through standardization, while yes, airports and radio stations were able to operate more efficiently because, well, everything was already aligned with federal guidelines. It also meant that there was an easier risk of, say, someone like American Airlines or a big radio company basically dominating their competitors through cartel practices, because they could just say to the government, hey, since everything's standardized, do you mind if we look over it? Which, let's face it, knowing the administration, certainly not above it. Public works, generally fine, waste of money on occasion, but at least it's building infrastructure and that can lead to economic growth later on. The tariffs, though, they were Hoover's big problem, and there's a good reason people called them out in particular. Because what was happening is prices were going down. Now, there's an efficient way to solve this. What this means is that supply has increased, but demand has stayed the same or gone down. Do you know a quick way to solve the demand problem? Exports. If instead of raising tariffs, the government said, all right, we're going to go a bit into debt to subsidize or dump our goods into other markets, well, guess what? Prices would start going up without lowering the amount of production. Thus, you would see an increase in profit for companies and increased demand. And it's not like the markets elsewhere weren't in need of goods. Remember, World War I was only a decade in the past. Europe was still recovering. That's not to mention that China and Japan were still behind in terms of technology. Now, Japan caught up a lot, and China was certainly trying, but they were still behind the Western world by and large. In fact, Japan recognized this and was why they copied a lot of Western designs for their arms, was to keep pace, at least partially, with the West by saying, well, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Copy the West, use their guns, and then we can continue our industry without much worry. And so, it's not like there wasn't a market. Indeed, with Hoover, a very good argument was negotiating with the British, because think about it. If you have low food prices, there's a very good argument for saying, hey Britain, tell you what, you lower any tariffs you still have on agricultural goods, maybe buy some of our goods. In exchange, we'll help you with something else, which, let's face it, Britain had need of help. Their empire was overstretched, it's a quarter of the world, and, of course, the war was putting a lot of pressure on them to reform the empire. Increasing U.S. trade, in particular, using low food prices to maintain stability, would have been very good for Britain. Now, is Britain guaranteed to do this? No, but still. There were numerous other options besides the tariffs. Because what the tariffs did was they made it worse. Because what would normally happen without the tariffs, because remember, the U.S. is still a net exporter at this time. It's not like it is now with the industry elsewhere in the U.S. importing it in exchange for services that they then use to make money. It is the workshop of the world. So, naturally, as a net exporter, it wants tariffs low. Because that way it can export more and more goods. And what happens in that situation is, without the tariffs, more goods are exported, demand goes up because, more people for your market to sell to, and thus prices stabilize, or they go up because more demand, especially if the supply maintains itself. So the tariffs were a big problem. Now, let's get into the other major leader during this time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, a lot of people look at FDR and say he did great. I am not of that opinion. I would say he was not our worst president by any stretch, but he definitely had major issues. So let's run through what he did. For one, he also did public works. That was one of his big things. And then, let's see, we got the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which involved literally destroying crops to increase prices. Now, I shouldn't need to explain why that's a horrible solution to a financial crisis, but let's do it anyways. During the days of the Agricultural Adjustment Act, it was later struck down and then modified into a similar form. What would happen is the government would pay you to destroy crops, pay you to slaughter livestock, all in an effort to reduce production so that prices would go up. Here's the issue. Not only is that destroying a lot of work, and it's not even making use of it, literally they would just slaughter hogs and then leave the pork to rot, but also it decreases the demand for jobs, because guess what? All of that cotton that was already destroyed, someone had to harvest that. That could have produced numerous jobs on its own. That pork, someone would have had to transport that, to sell that. That's jobs lost, because they just slaughtered them all. It subsidized poor decisions on the behalf of farmers, and it did not help the problem. Horrible decision. You raised taxes. Again, bad decision during a recession. Now, if he was in, say, the roaring 20s, fair time to raise taxes. Yes, it lowers economic growth, but there was debt to pay off, there was things that needed to be done. Fair enough. Especially because we haven't figured out a way to deal with our blossoming budget due to increased social spending without greater taxes. There was justification during a period of prosperity, especially because limiting that growth a bit, since it was triggered by the government getting involved in the first place, would have minimized the amount of blowback that would have come from a depression. But doing it during a recession, especially a prolonged one like the Great Depression, was a very poor decision. Because yes, it did help to balance the budget. Now, well, it was still a massive deficit, but it ended up causing more jobs to be lost in the long run than were actually solved and brought back. So, poor decision by FDR there. There was also a minimum wage. Now, I may get heat for this, but it is true that a minimum wage is not good during a recession, or at all, actually. See, as I mentioned earlier with propping up the wages, it's the same principle here with the minimum wage. People, especially the inexperienced, need something to enter into the workforce. They need to gain experience. Best way to do that is a lower wage. Take a lower wage, work yourself up, and eventually you get paid higher and higher, and you build the experience that you can work elsewhere for a higher wage. Minimum wage stops that, but more importantly during a recession, it creates issues with businesses because, well, they're already running on thin margins as it is. If they have to pay an extra, let's say, $80 per worker and they only make $100, well, that limits their working very heavily. They can't hire more people, which makes it harder to produce more, meaning prices go up further and people can't buy things. People can't buy things, no one gets anything, no profit. The recession continues. Minimum wages are actually detrimental to an economy overall. He also allowed unions. I'm not going to complain about that. I'm actually someone who tolerates unions because I believe it is firmly in the voluntary association. But minimum wage, not a good idea. He also reduced tariffs. Good decision. I won't critique that. And then there's the matter of the war, specifically Lend-Lease. Now, I'm going to disagree with a lot of people who usually argue against FDR here, because I am a firm supporter of the war, and specifically U.S. involvement in it. I firmly believe that we should have gotten into Germany in 1933, Italy in 1936, and Japan in 1937. Why? Because, one, war helps an economy. In fact, the Depression ended because of the economy. If you actually look into the economic data, that is the truth. World War II is what brought the economic recovery to a peak enough to actually get us out of the Depression. The New Deal basically softened the blow. It did not solve the problem. In fact, it arguably made it worse because, again, you raised taxes, simultaneously made it harder for people to work, and ruined the crops. That is not a recipe for recovery. That is a recipe for prolonged suffering. But war, for all its destruction, can help an economy get a quick boost. Because think about it. The logistics of war is massively expensive. You need ammunition, you need guns, you need tanks, trucks, planes, ships, which means steel, plastic later on, and numerous other factors and resources. It creates massive demand. Massive demand means a lot of purchases, especially because it's the government. That means profit for corporations, which means they can hire more people. People get hired, so they get wages, so they can start buying things. It's a good way to basically give a quick jump start to an economy if you really need it. Not a recommended way necessarily, but in this case, especially with how much Hoover screwed it up, I would not complain that much if FDR got in the war a lot sooner. Especially because it would have reduced a lot of the major problems that came with the war and its prolonged nature. We freaking knew what Italy, Japan, and the Nazis wanted to do from the start. I mean, Hitler published a book explaining what he wanted to do. Mussolini pretty clearly demonstrated what he wanted to do. And Japan, well, let's face it, even if we knew what they wanted to do, their military is pretty clearly trying to expand ever since Manchuria. Like, we knew what the Axis powers freaking wanted. This wasn't out of the blue. So just ending the war quickly, bringing much needed prestige to the United States and economic revenue for our corporations and workers would have massively helped. So, needless to say, I am a firm supporter of Lend-Lease and would argue it actually helped the economy because it increased demand for goods. And that's the thing. The biggest thing is to increase demand for goods. Because supply is great. Supply is the backbone of an economy. You don't have anything to buy or sell, you don't have an economy. But to sustain it, you need demand. You need people to be able to afford things so that when they want something, they can buy it. When they want to save, they can. You can't do that if you're constantly making it harder to have money. Essentially, the goal should not be to restrict the money supply. Truthfully, you shouldn't try to artificially expand it either, because that's the recipe for a bubble. But you shouldn't treat the money supply as something to be strangled. It is something that should just be allowed to flow organically. And things like raising taxes, raising minimum wage, and reducing supply, meaning demand naturally has to be sustained with fewer things, and jobs can't be created from agriculture, well, that doesn't help. So, that is what did happen. We should also note, he did establish Social Security. Not a good thing. The way it was set up was rather poor and didn't really help our situation. I'll get into it with the should, I'll delay it, but essentially, it functions on an assumption of an ever-growing population, and that's simply not how things work. There's the old, and then there's the workers. The idea is that while you're a worker, you pay so that when you're old, you get money. Here's the issue. It relies on the assumption of an ever-growing economy, an ever-growing population, because as the old die out, workers move up, they become old, and new workers are supposed to replace them. Well, what happens if, say, everything stables out, if it's a one-to-one in terms of population? You basically have to take the check of an entire worker's work week to support an old person in that same week. That is not a sustainable model. Now then, let's say, hypothetically, I was president. Terrifying, I know. Now, to give this the hardest, let's assume Hoover's already gone through in the presidency and I am next. Right? So, after Hoover, what should have been done? First things first, reduce the freaking tariffs, because the entire point is, again, to make sure that people can trade, can make deals, sell things, buy things, let commerce flow. not only would that actually increase revenue, assuming there's still some tariffs and there's a sales tax, it would also, importantly, allow for the price problems to be abated because, again, you can sell goods to other countries. You can also make negotiations with other countries like Britain to say, lower their tariffs in exchange for you lowering yours. So that's number one, reduce the tariffs. 2, reduce taxes. Again, you need people to not only find employment, but want to buy goods. If people can't buy goods, your businesses can't make money. If your businesses can't make money, they can't employ people, and thus the cycle continues. Constant regulation does not help that. Raising taxes does not help that. Reducing taxes has been proven time and again to do that. In fact, it was done early in the 1920s to stop a brief recession. So that is what you should do first and foremost. Reduce tariffs, reduce taxes. Now, as things go along, I would actually suggest militarization. Now, this is for a particular reason. Let's face it, during the 30s, it was pretty clear something was going to go down. Maybe not what was known, but something was known to occur. Think about it. Germany's remilitarizing. They're doing it flagrantly in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. Italy's ruled by a fascist who very clearly is taking more and more power into his own hands, and Japan's military is causing issues in Manchuria after the Mukden incident. Things are occurring. It's very clear the United States needs to militarize in order to handle these threats. So, militarization is, yes, what I would suggest. Now, getting congressional approval, that'll be more difficult, but that's where politics comes in. So a few trades, maybe, for example, allowing unions, or at least making them more legal, would be a bone to throw. Not that I would really oppose it. It's basically giving up something I'm fine to lose. And, of course, just stay the course. Remember, the objective is to get out of the recession as quickly as possible. The best way to do that is to let people recover naturally. The biggest problem a lot of governments have is they want to get involved. I get it. Recessions aren't popular. Makes sense for obvious reasons. But when the government gets involved, often, almost all the time when it happens, and they try to solve it, the things they do to solve it cause a recession later because they create a bubble. If there's suddenly an influx of cash from the government, and that cash isn't going to come back later, then the economy builds itself on something that will not last. It's essentially like drinking alcohol or taking a drug. Feels great in the moment, but when it doesn't last, you get hungover or you suffer withdrawal. You don't want to spike the money. That results in inflation, which doesn't help the average person's wage, and it results in a bubble. For example, I'll use a later example with the dot-com bubble. In order to recover from the dot-com bubble, the Clinton administration used the Federal Reserve to lower interest rates, pressuring it to engage in actions which would lower interest rates, especially when it came to realty prices. The idea being, if you lower the interest rates, loans get easier to take, businesses stirred, fairly logical. But here's the thing. Because of that influx of cheap money, guess what happened? A bunch of people took out loans to buy homes, to reinvest, to better the homes, or use them as financial assets. The Glass-Steagall Act did not cause the Great Recession of 2008. Clinton's loans did, and the Federal Reserve did, because those cheap loans were causing so much inflation that when the government went to fix inflation by cracking down on it and letting interest rates rise, guess what? All those home loans that relied on interest rates being cheap, well, suddenly they were invalid. A lot of them defaulted, and thus, oh wait. What you want to do, whether you want to militarize like I would suggest, or you want to just reduce tariffs, reduce taxes, and go for a full laissez-faire approach, one truth maintains itself. The government should not take massive financial injections to the economy as a serious proposal. Because what happens almost always, basically 99% of the time if I'm being honest, is that creates the situation for a new recession. And if your goal is to stop a recession, that should not be what you're doing. It just isn't. The Great Depression serves, as far as I am concerned, as the best demonstration of why people think they know what is best for everyone else, even when they don't. Is my plan flawless? Certainly not. But hindsight being what it is, it's a lot more effective, by and large, than the plans instituted by the people at the time. Because I'm able to say what works, what doesn't, especially in later recessions. Reducing tariffs definitely helped. Reducing taxes helped in the 80s. Militarization was shown to help with World War II, and staying a course and allowing things to recover naturally has shown itself to work in several early US recessions. I have data to back this up. FDR was working on essentially a very paternalistic view without the background in economics to truly know what was best for the people. He had ideas, don't get me wrong, and I'll give him this. He was very committed to his ideas. I can respect him for his stubbornness and his willingness to push through. I can do that. That doesn't mean his policies weren't awful. When John Maynard Keynes, the man who literally argued for these types of measures, public works projects, minimum wages, a welfare state, all these things to try to fix an economy, when even he is saying your economic plans aren't good, which he did do to FDR, you can see why I would not say that FDR handled the Depression in even a good way. Now, he tried. He did better than Hoover for the most part, but he still didn't do good. That's like saying a turd is slightly better than another turd. Just because it's cleaner does not suddenly change the fact that it's still a turd. I can respect FDR for his charisma and for his devotion to the American people. Easily. I cannot respect him for his policies, because they don't work. Not in the real world. Sure, in some imagination of some sociology professor, maybe they do. But in the world as it is, with the data we have, it has been shown not to. And so that is my big critique of the response to the Great Depression. It's an attempt by people to plan for something they could not realistically plan for. A depression at this level was not something that could be solved by a bunch of politicians in a boardroom voting on legislation. It can only be solved by giving the people the means to solve it themselves. Even the militarization I propose, cannot fully function without the people buying stuff on their own, without people investing in their own economies, being entrepreneurs, choosing to pick jobs that they could work and could make money off of, and then establishing their own businesses. Because as we see with World War II, yes, militarization can give your economy the jolt it needs to really get out of the Depression, or any recession, really. But once you have to demilitarize, once you have to shrink that army, send people back to the civilian front, all those things, guess what happens? Your economy stalls, and that's exactly what we see in our economy after the Depression. It goes up rapidly with the militarization, then there's a massive recession as demilitarization comes, and, well, it recovers shortly after, but still. There's a jolt because that money, which was invested in the military, is now no longer there, and the economy has to make up for it on the civilian side. You cannot, with the economy, just spend your way out of it. That is the recipe for a bubble. And so we can use the Depression as a great example of why. We can analyze why these planners could not practically handle the recession. and why it lasted as long as it did. Bad policies at the start, among many others, led to a depression that could not be solved with a simple change of law involving Social Security, taxation, or wages. What it needed was to basically allow the consumer to fix it themselves. And it may take time, but it would eventually happen. Trying to be a paternalistic figure, micromanaging everything, saying this needs to be done here, this needs to be done here. Not only did it rack up the US one of its largest debts until modern times, which was largely compounded by New Deal policies, but also it fundamentally stalled our recovery. The Great Depression is a learning experience. Let's hope we actually learn from it. Thank you very much.